So welcome. We've got a question already. Where is Mark located at the moment?
Melbourne town.
Melbourne town, in lockdown.
Exactly.
Well, not excellent, terrible.
I want some of what Amanda's got.
Okay, so I think that we have a critical mass in. So welcome everyone to Avid Reader. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on in this area, the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we are zooming out onto the lands of many different Aboriginal people all around Australia. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders as well, past and present. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. So tonight, I'm very happy to be hosting this event with Miranda Rero and Mark Brandi, talking about Mark's book. And you guys on Zoom will be on silent for the duration, but what I'm going to do is I am going to put a little link into the chat function, and that is where you can ask questions. So I'm just about to do that now. So if you don't use Zoom regularly, I'm about to pop a link in to Mark's book. This is where you can purchase Mark's book at Avid Reader, and definitely check that out and put your order in, or order from your local lockdown bookstore, because we do support the bookstores that are in lockdown as well. So tonight, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Miranda Rero, who is the author of a multi-award-winning book, Stones Go Old Mountain, which is actually currently on the shortlist for the David Award. So that's really fantastic. She's also the author of The Fish Girl, which is a wonderful novella. If you have not checked out Miranda's books, you absolutely should. It's amazing. And Miranda is going to be in conversation with Mark Brandi, who of course is a fantastic writer. I'm just admitting some more people. Sorry if I'm distracted. So Miranda is going to be in conversation with Mark Brandi. Mark Brandi's best-selling novel Wimmera won the coveted British Crime Writers Association debut dagger and was named Best Debut at the 2018 Australian Indie Book Awards. It was also shortlisted for the Australian Book Industry Awards Literary Fiction Book of the Year and the Matt Richdale Award for New Writer of the Year. His second novel, The Rip, was published to great acclaim by Hachette in 2019, and we're here tonight to celebrate the publication of The Others. And I'm very sad that we're not in real life for this as well, Mark, because we were really looking forward, particularly to going out to dinner afterwards. After this, but
we look forward to.
We look forward to here in Brisbane. We also get to share this moment with you online anyway, and we're really glad that we could share it with you on Zoom. So thank you for being with us. And welcome to everybody here who is also annoyingly in lockdowns all over the country. I really do feel for you. And don't worry, we are not, at Brisbane here, we're not kind of saying, yay, we're not in lockdown, because anything can happen to us. So solidarity to all of you. And I'm going to hand over to the wonderful Miranda Rero.
Thank you, Chrissy. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming along tonight, and thank you for having us, Avid Reader. Welcome, Mark Brandi. Congratulations on this fantastic novel. It's just so good. It's a ripper. Like, I just sped through it. Couldn't get enough of it. I'm going to read a small intro, but it's the usual blurb. It is the blurb that comes with it, because I didn't want to give anything away too much. So I'm just going to let everybody know the tiny blurb. So on his 11th birthday, Jacob's father gives him a diary so he can write about the sheep, the crop, the fox, and the dam. But Jacob knows some things should not be written down. Some things should not be remembered. The only things he knows for sure are what his fathers taught him. Sheltered, protected, isolated. But who's his father protecting him from? And how far will his father go to keep the world at bay? All too soon, Jacob will learn that sometimes people do the most terrible things. Ooh, Mark, what was the first inspiration for this story? Like about this boy who's writing about his reclusive life with his dad. What sparked the idea for you?
Yeah, well, firstly, thanks to Chrissy and Avid Reader for having me. It's such a pleasure to be able to have this event. You know, it would have been wonderful to do it in real life, but I'm just happy that everyone is still able to come along and join us tonight. So in terms of inspiration, it's a funny one. I always feel a little bit disingenuous in a way talking about what inspired my books, because when I sit down to write, I don't really know in some ways. Like I'll just start working with a voice, and it's really when I suppose I come to do publicity for a book that I think, oh God, I can't go out there and say I don't know when I get asked. So I just you know, I do think quite deeply about it and reflect on it, and I guess there's probably a kind of a practical spark for this story in a way, which really was a short story that I wrote back in 2016, so before Wimmera came out, and that was published in Meanjin, and that was based on some actual real events from my youth. It was a fictionalized account of something that happened in my childhood. And that was really I grew up in a regional town in Western Victoria. I was born in Italy, but we had a pub, and I lived in the pub with my family. But we also had a farm outside of town. On the farm, we had sheep, and as a consequence of having sheep, we had issues with vermin like, you know, foxes, rabbits, mice, all that sort of stuff. And we used to go hunting out on the farm, which I had really like mixed feelings about as a kid, you know, like I really loved animals, but I kind of understood why we had to do it. And my dad used to set, I don't know if you remember those kind of steel-jawed traps that were around. I don't think they're legal anymore, or at least not for, you know, things like rabbits and such. And my dad used to set these traps out on the farm. And I remember on one occasion, he came home and he said, Mark, come out to the car. I've got something to show you. And I went out there, and in the back of the Kingswood, which we had in those days, there was a little bundle there, a blanket. And he reached in and he took out this fox, like he had like a young fox, which he then brought into the house, and he proceeded, like I was transfixed by this. I was thinking, you know, what's going to happen here? You know, here's this animal we've just tried to kill, and he's bringing it into the house. And he proceeded to dress the wound on its leg and was really quite tender with it. And he then made an enclosure for it in the backyard, and we basically kept it like a pet. And
so it was quite tame.
Yeah, well, it was wild. It was just a
wild
young fox. But we then cared for it more or less. It was tame. And I suppose that was kind of like one of the first insights I had really into some of the complexities and contradictions, I suppose, of adulthood and of my father and of parenthood in particular. And I won't give away what happened in that particular story because it's kind of germane to the novel. But I suppose it was that intrigue which really took me back to that voice of the young boy, and that's where the others started.
Right, that's really interesting. Okay, so Jacob's the protagonist, the boy. So Jacob is quite insightful, yet he's naive about the world too, obviously, because he's just living with his father on this farm, which we see through what he draws and what he looks up in his encyclopedias and his dictionary, but also in his interpretation of these things, like that he reads about, but that he doesn't quite understand. I thought these aspects of the novel were really brilliant in drawing out like who Jacob was. Do you mind reading a small section for us, which I think really shows what you've done with Jacob?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Sure.
Just to give us a taste.
Yes. So this, just to contextualise it, Jacob and his father have gone up the hill to collect some firewood just outside their property, and they're in a very, very isolated location, and they're just heading back to the farm just before this happens. We saw my mother on the way back. She's not on the farm, she's in the bush, off the main track, about halfway down from where we get the wood. I didn't really feel like going. It's not because I didn't care, but because the wood was heavy and because I wanted to see what the sheep were doing, but I couldn't say so. It's hard to care so much because she was gone before I could ever really know her. I'd never say that out loud, and definitely not to him. And it's not her fault, because it's been me and him pretty much the whole time. I remember some things though, some things about her. I think I do. I remember how she used to smooth my hair. I'd be sitting on the floor by the fire, between her knees, and she'd smooth my hair with her hands, especially if I was upset. I liked the feeling. I remember feeling warm and safe by the fire. I liked the feeling of being close to her. Be brave. That's what she said. I told him about it once, and he didn't remember her ever saying that. He said maybe it happened, but it could be my imagination. But why would I remember those words so clearly if she never said them? I remember some other things too, other things I haven't told him, things I don't like so much, like hearing her crying. I remember that, the feeling of it. I don't think it's my imagination. Same with the other thing. But I never asked him about the crying. There's probably a word for when a child is a widow, when they lose their mother or their father or both. Maybe I'll ask him. It'd be good if there was some kind of reverse dictionary where I could look up the meanings to find out what the word is. I don't have a photo of my mother. I only have a picture of her in my mind. She had black hair, curly, a big smile, and pale skin. There's a woman in one of the magazines that looks a bit like my mother. It's in one of her old magazines, the Women's Weekly. Her name is Elizabeth Taylor, the woman in the photo. She has dark, shiny eyes, white teeth, and bright red lips. I don't know my mother's name. I don't think it matters so much. You're not supposed to call your mother or father by their names. I'm not sure why, but he told me that once. I'd like to know, though, what her name is.
Oh, so beautiful. I have one silly question to ask. When I was reading it and I saw the women, and there's another part, and he's looking at his Women's Weekly, and he describes an actor, and this shows my age. I thought, that's Larry Hagman. And then it was Larry Hagman. And my question is, did you actually consult for this character an actual Women's Weekly? Like, did you have one beside you from a certain era that you used?
No.
You use your imagination.
I used the depths of my imagination. And also,
well, now you're showing your age, Mark.
That's right. It was also like remembering things from my childhood, because
yes,
like in that, and without giving away the era that the book's set, but in that time, as you'd remember, like pre-internet, and living in a country town too, like whatever kind of cultural, what appeared to be, cultural information that you could find, you picked up and you just absorbed and read so much into. And I used to pick up like my mum's Women's Weekly or Women's Day, and read it, look at the pictures and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
but I know, like, when I was writing it, and I had that kind of diary form in mind, or that's just what worked, I suppose, for his voice. When I was putting it in that form, it was kind of like, you know, I'd be thinking, what would he do now? Like, I was very much in his viewpoint, in his world, and thinking, what would he do? Oh, he would look in the Woman's Weekly, or he'd check the dictionary, or look in the encyclopedia. That just kind of made sense to where he was at in the world,
Yeah.
and trying to contextualize his experience, I suppose. But yeah, Elizabeth Taylor, Larry Hagman makes an appearance, David Hasselhoff, I think, as well. Yeah,
It's really quite touching, especially the Elizabeth Taylor bits. This sort of touches on what you were just talking about. Like, I don't want to give too much away, but I love how you tap into the loneliness of this boy, you know, and how he feels, and you show things that reveal his loneliness. But then that's juxtaposed with this line, which is in blurbs. Sometimes you have to do the most terrible things. Sometimes you just have to. I think his father says that to him. This must have been quite the balancing act when writing the novel. Was it hard?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of, I suppose, tension between, well, I mean, you're writing from a position of naivety with a child. He's trying to understand his world, and his experiences in a way. And I think what you really see with Jacob is a coming of age, in a sense.
Yeah.
So he's trying to understand what's going around him, and he's, you know, gradually realizing that everything that his father's telling him isn't necessarily correct.
Yes.
So that's a kind of tension that you're working through from a craft perspective, I guess, as a writer.
Yes. Yeah, I have another question there. It's about how it's so interesting that Jacob, although so sheltered, often writes about the things his dad tells him, but he writes which might be true. So he questions, even though his dad gives him all the information he has, he even questions it. So yeah, it must have been really difficult showing that sort of balance to character.
Well, I think it was partly what was enjoyable about writing it too, because I was conscious of the reader, of course, and the adult reader kind of being able to piece together what was really going on here.
Yeah.
Part of that is expressed, as you pointed out, through his illustrations and his use of magazines and definitions and things like that.
Yeah.
But almost seeing, in a way, an expression sometimes of his subconscious and his doubt about what's occurring. And, you know, the isolation is an interesting one. Because I think that has an impact, obviously, on Jacob, but also on the father in this case. And in part that was driven, and I think that this again is more in hindsight, but partly driven by or inspired by the experience my father had growing up in rural Italy, because he lived on a very remote property out on a farm. He was the second eldest of 7 children, and his father was a very really difficult man, to say the least. Like, he was an alcoholic, he was violent, a womanizer. My grandmother actually divorced him, which, if you think about, like, post-war Italy, you know, very Catholic, patriarchal society,
Okay.
was extremely rare. It gives you some indication of the sort of guy he was. But I suppose I was, you know, part of what I think drove this story was that question around, you know, nature versus nurture, I suppose, to what extent those early childhood experiences, say for my dad and also for Jacob, how much they shape you as adults. And I suppose that it has been at the heart in some ways of my 2 earlier books as well, in Wimmera and The Rip, because in Wimmera you saw with, you know, Ben and Fab, the kind of impact of these terrible things from their youth, and with The Rip too, with Danny and its some incidences from her childhood which impact her later in life. And I think that is, you know, that kind of trauma is something I was interested in exploring. And, you know, I don't think that those things invariably drive you in a particular direction in life. That isn't my belief. I think it's far more complex than that. And I know, like, for my dad, that he was really determined not to repeat the sins of his father. So I guess, yeah, that those are the kind of questions which really drove the book. But I don't know if I answer them completely, but I don't know that that's
really interesting.
Yeah, necessarily the role of literature either. Sometimes I think, you know, sometimes it's enough to pose questions to a reader.
Okay, so going back to voice, like sinking into his voice, into Jacob's voice. So as we know, the story is told through his diary entries. And the interesting thing is, like, immediately you're in his head. Like, it's so beautifully done, and it feels really emotionally true. And there's one line that really resonated with me at the beginning, where he thinks, I'm searching for the feeling, which I think is kind of what authors do when they're trying to, you know, find their voice, or what they're writing is like searching for that feeling. Was that for you how it was finding Jacob? Like, did his voice sort of was it always consistent, or were there times later that you're like, oh, well, no, that doesn't ring true, or could you really just sink into him?
A bit of both, really. I mean, I feel like I've got, you know, that sort of inner child that we all have, you know, that even as adults, which we try to deny, but it's something which I can, I feel like I can tap into fairly easily when I write. So, like, I love writing in that voice, and that young voice, and that world. I think it's a really interesting point that you said about, like, searching for the feeling. That is exactly, like, you're giving expression to a feeling a lot of the time when you're writing, and it's not. I didn't have, like, a clear idea about where it was heading, or what was going to happen with Jacob and his father. Necessarily, like, you have kind of a broad direction you think it's going to go, but I didn't have a clear path. And I suppose as I went along, I found that, you know, you're always kind of thinking a chapter or two ahead, like, what's going to come up next, and I'd have an idea about something which was going to happen, and then find that when I got there, because of what I'd learned about Jacob's character along the way, and how he becomes more realised to me, more fully realised, that I would come to think, oh, hang on a minute, he wouldn't necessarily do that in that situation, or perhaps that is a little too precocious. And that's always, like, the danger, I think, you know, in writing the young voice, that you kind of use them as a puppet for your own adult at the world, and you have to be really careful of that. But at the same time, you know, you need to be able to paint a world that's vivid enough and real enough for the adult reader, and that's, like, again, like, one of the tensions in writing that sort of book, and a constraint, really, which I don't think is a bad thing. Like, having constraint in any art form, I think, can be beneficial. So yeah, it wasn't like, it was hard. I'm not gonna, like, it was bloody hard to write. Like, I found it. I don't know if it's because of where I am in my kind of, like, path as a writer, or you know, what I've learned along the way, but I found this one more difficult than the other.
Really?
Yeah, it was.
Wow.
And that's more, I suppose, on as much an emotional level. Like, I found it really exhausting and draining experience to write. Like, I came out the other side of it, and I was just like, oh man, I like need a rest. Like, I really need a rest from that. It was
wow.
It got a lot out of me.
Well, it paid off.
Thank you.
Look, this is what I've really wondered about. So in the book, there are some gorgeous little drawings in his diary, but there's drawings in the book. And I think actually I read somewhere that you said maybe originally there weren't the drawings, but anyway, there's drawings there now because he talks about his drawings in his diary. And there's such a fascinating part of the narrative because we learn so much about what Jacob knows, but also what he doesn't know or what he guesses about things by his drawings, you know, like what a town looks like, you know. So could you just tell us about how you came up with thinking of the drawings, and also, Mark, did you do those drawings?
Well, that's the
They're
thing.
very cute drawings.
Thank you. Well, I did do those drawings, and so like if you pick up this book, you get some terrible insight into my psyche that you probably don't want. But it was weird, you know, because when I actually, funnily enough, I looked back at my first draft today. I went into my file and looked, and it's kind of in that diary form, and like a chapter per document, more or less. And I had the spaces in there, which I remember doing it. Like I'd write in there, picture of a lamb here, or
okay.
Of a fox here. So when I was drafting it, it kind of came to me that you know, what would a young boy do here to try to explain himself? He'd draw a picture in his diary, you know. So I just left a space for it, more or less. And then when I got through, it might not have been the end of the first draft, but the second draft, I thought, great, I'm going to go back and do those illustrations now. It was like late at night, so I got out like a whole lot of paper and thought, okay, you know, Jacob's trying to explain a rabbit trap. Here's how he'd do it, and sort of trying to put myself in that mindset. And I didn't really, at that point, think, well, firstly, I hadn't even discussed it with my publisher. Like I hadn't discussed the book with my publisher.
Right.
And so I didn't know if they were going to like it or not. But secondly, I didn't, I really didn't know if they'd go for the illustrations. And if they did, I kind of thought they'll get someone, you know, proper in to do the illustrations. Like, it isn't going to be my illustrations. And
the 12-year-old illustration.
The 12-year-old me, yeah, or expressed through Jacob, you know. Yeah. And so I didn't think that was going to happen. But so those illustrations which you see there were the exact same ones that I did, you know, at 11, that fateful night. But I think that, you know, in hindsight, I think that was good in a way, because I didn't, you know, I wasn't self-conscious about it. I was very much, and I was really in that voice at the time. So it was the right time to be doing it and to use those. And I, you know, you kind of hit the nail on the head too, that they really express something. You know, often they're just illustrative of what he's saying, but other times they're more pivotal to the plot and what's going on, and also just an expression of his understanding, really, probably at a deeper level, at a subconscious level, of what's really going on, but that as a child he can't necessarily give voice to, and particularly can't give voice to his father. So it's being expressed in this way. I loved doing the illustrations.
Oh, it's really just such a great part of the book. I was jealous as another author. I was jealous. It was just so, great. What have I got here? The book's themes deal with issues like mental illness and the aftermath of like a pandemic. And I was wondering if this was intentional, like maybe as, you know, a reflection of the past 18 months, or was it something that was just always present in your idea of the story, and I guess our pandemic just sort of fed nicely into it?
Yeah,
when you were writing the novel.
Yeah, well, I was writing it like I'd started it in 2018, so it was predated pandemic. So that idea, I suppose, of a plague happening, and again, without being, so I've got to be careful of spoilers, but that isolationist mindset. worked. And I suppose when, you know, when we started, when the pandemic sort of began, I was in the editing stage for this book, and it was kind of weird, you know, because it's sort of like you're seeing things happening, I suppose, in terms of how people reacted to the news that kind of had echoes of some of the things in the book. I think, you know, you have a proportion of the population who are in denial that it's real, and other people who, you know, think it's a government conspiracy and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, I sometimes feel as though we, particularly in urban areas and you know, in the world of literature and culture, that we can think that a lot of people might think like us or have the same beliefs as us, but I you know, from my personal experience, I know that isn't true. And like when I was growing up in the country, I remember there were a lot of people like who would move from interstate or perhaps from the city, God knows where, and they'd buy like a property sort of outside of town, and not really isolated. I'm talking like 10 Ks out, you know, maybe have an Australian flag, kind of flagpole out the front, or maybe not. And a lot of these people were, you know, off the grid. And I don't mean energy sense, but culturally and socially. Like they had no, and this was their desire. They had no like wish to be part of kind of what we might consider mainstream society, which is a valid choice. But that kind of isolation can breed, I suppose, some pretty wacky ideas sometimes. And as we see again with the pandemic, the kind of I suppose narrowcasting that social media offers, where people can gather and have their own views reflected back at them. Yeah, it's a strange time to be in. It's a strange time to be writing literature in this space. I mean, I don't necessarily believe that, you know, like I'd love the idea that you know, books can be prescient and predict what's coming, but I think, you know, pandemics, dystopias have been a staple of fiction for many years. It's just a sad reality that we're dealing with a, you know, borderline dystopia at the moment. But,
I know.
hopefully that changes.
You said so you started this in 2018. This is just a craft question from me. Can you move between projects when you are writing?
So you mean like from...
like if you were starting on this in 2018, I assume you were probably working on The Rip or something?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So The Rip had been, I guess, accepted by my publisher.
Oh, okay. So it was already sort of done.
Yeah, it was already kind of mainly in hand, I suppose. There was only kind of like, well, not major structural edits or anything like that to come. If I thought that there were structural edits, I would definitely stay in that lane.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was curious about, but I guess I just forgot for a while how long it takes to write a novel.
Yeah. I think I'd find it really hard to move cross projects.
Yeah. And when you were writing this, did you read like other novels or research anything to sort of, you know, I don't know, to inform this particular novel, which is a bit different from your others?
Yeah. I don't know if
any authors, or is there anything you sort of read to get a feel for what you wanted to try and do?
I suppose I'd say that like Cormac McCarthy's The Road was a definite influence on this book, and it wasn't again something I was necessarily conscious of when writing it, but I read The Road, I think that was probably about 5 or 6 years ago, and that had a profound impact on me when I read it, and again sort of has it's a father and son in a kind of post-apocalyptic dystopia, but a different dynamic with the father and son too. But I suppose that was, you know, I'd be, I think it'd be cheeky of me to say that that wasn't an influence, because there are definite parallels to the story. But it was funny when I was like, you know, preparing for this book coming out, I was really reluctant to mention that book because I was fearful that people think I'm comparing my work to Cormac McCarthy or anything like that.
Yeah, but people have.
Yeah. Oh well.
You're not the first.
But you sort of you don't want to be doing that yourself. That's
no, I see that.
Kind of you're careful. You don't want to like yourself up for a big.
No, but I think it's fair enough to sort of read things around what you're trying to achieve yourself.
Yeah, sure. Like I'm just trying to think if there's anything. There was a definite book, like my absolute darling. I don't know if you read that, Gabrielle Talent.
No.
Which is a father and daughter in a very isolated sort of situation. Very dark, extremely dark book. And for me to be saying something's very dark,
yeah. Must be dark.
It's very dark.
Okay.
It's pretty confronting. But look, there's all. I mean, you know, it's like it's stuff feeds in. Like it can't help but feed in. It's like you're always trying to write into new territory. You're trying to say something different and new. You want to have something to say, but you know, the works of other authors always influence you.
Yeah. I was reading a while ago about Margaret Atwood. She collects clippings, like she's got folders and folders of clippings and everything. And she was writing, and it was an article about how she wrote The Handmaid's Tale and how she got she just had years worth of clippings about, you know, like fertility rights or non-rights, you know, and things like that, or murder and blah, 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 and how it all sort of came together as, you know, what she writes. Do you collect sort of stories or anything like that? I know, like Michael Rowbotham say he also collects, like, you know, like far out stories and then writes a whole book about, you know, out of the one sort of thing in the news. Do you collect anything?
I probably, I mean, I gather stuff in my bookmarks in like my web browser, which I file under, like, you know, for research, and then never ever open again.
That too.
They tend to be sort of like kind of articles about sort of interesting ideas, I suppose, that probably feed into my writing more so than particular events. So I suppose I do, like, I read a lot about crimes, like real crimes, because I just find it fascinating. I find that you know, those darker aspects of humanity just so interesting, and the kind of circumstances that people find themselves in, where often, you know, quite what we might consider well-adjusted and relatively normal people will do extreme things, and the courts are full of those cases. I think as readers, you know, it's natural to be attracted to that darker stuff, because we almost have like I think a neurological predisposition to read about that stuff, because we're looking for, it's almost like a survival mechanism. Naturally, we're attracted to bad news, and we want to read about it, to know about it, to avoid that.
And trying to analyze it, and, you know, all the technicalities to put down.
Exactly. I mean, you know, and this isn't a crime example, but we've probably seen it play out even with, you know, the vaccinations, and the newspaper headlines, of course, are, you know, drawn to the clotting cases and people dying from that, and that's what makes news, and that's what we read about and go, oh my God, but we don't read about the kind of good news that all these millions of people get vaccinated and protected. But there's something you know, innate to do with us as humans that makes us want to read that stuff. And I think I'm always like drawn to reading that kind of material and reading about those sort of cases, and that feeds into my work. But I don't have sort of like a, you know, a folder anywhere with a you know.
I sometimes do just in my notes, and like with you, I never go back to them, but just my notes on my phone, and through it I'll just put idea, and then I'll put like idea, and I never. Sometimes though I'm desperate and I go back.
I have a file called novel ideas and like documents like that, which I never.
Terrible.
It's like where ideas go to die. Basically.
I know they're really terrible. Or I get there and I'm like, what was that about? Like I just.
I should actually call it like ideas graveyard would be more accurate.
Yeah, just forget it.
We have heaps of questions.
Sorry?
We have heaps of audience
Heaps
questions.
of questions. Okay, I just want to ask one question for just for all the budding authors out there who might be too shy to ask you, Mark. But what's your process? Tell us your process. What do you do? What do you do like every day? Do you have a word count? Blah blah blah.
Blah blah blah. I'm an insomniac, so I get up quite late. So I probably don't start. If I'm in that drafting stage, I probably start around midday. And if I'm say on a first draft, I might spend between 1 and 2 hours like actually writing. The rest of the time is all the other kind of research slash procrastination stuff that happens around writing. I try to stay connected with the manuscript every day if I can when I'm in the drafting stage. So even if I don't have much time, even if it's like just reading over the last thing I wrote, just so I stay in touch with it and what I was thinking. And when I get through that first draft phase, I'll normally park it for like a month, 2,
Wow.
Before
That's
I
very
go.
disciplined.
Yeah, I try to. I mean, I don't know how. That's the kind of idea that I'll leave it for that long. But I always like, I'm anxious to go back to it. But I find that the more time I have between drafts, the more objective I suppose I can be. I can look at it a bit more clearly. So yeah, and then it's just repeating that process over and over and over again until it's in some kind of cohesive form that I'm
Do you write A to Z? Like I write quite linear, like I go from the beginning to the end. And I know some people do a sort of patchwork kind of way. Do you?
Yeah, I kind of, it sometimes ends up being a bit of a patchwork. Like I can try to, I think it's linear, but then I'll go, oh, hang on, no, this works better if I move it here and all that kind of, and that's more at that structural phase, when I'm working through the drafts. But I don't know, and you get to a stage where you've just got to go, it has to go. I have to give it to a reader,
Somebody else.
Yeah.
Yeah. And do you have a word count?
I used to. I think I used to sort of go like 1,000 words sort of drafting, but I don't. I mean, it's nice when you make those word counts and like when you check your word count at the end of the day and go, oh, I did well. That's great. But I'm probably less adherent to that nowadays. What I try to do is leave it at a point where I'm still feeling good about it.
Right.
Like if something interesting is happening and I'm still feeling good about it, because then I know I'll be excited to go back to it the next day. Whereas if I leave it at a point where I'm going, I don't know what's going to happen next, or I'm sort of worried or stressed that this whole thing might just not be working, it just makes it that bit tougher.
Yeah. If I didn't have a word count, I literally would write maybe 100 words and be happy with myself and wander off.
So have you got like,
I have to be a bit stricter with myself.
How many words do you go for?
But, well, when I'm writing, so I don't always write. So when I'm actually like sitting down, I want to write this novel, I'm like you, I like to be with it every day just to keep in it. And I try to aim for 500.
That's pretty good.
Or else I'll pike much.
I'm sure your 500 are a lot more polished than my 1,000.
I don't know what to think about. Chrissy.
Yes,
did you say there's lots of questions?
There's lots of questions. So let's see how many we get through. That was really fascinating, by the way. Thank you, Brandi, for asking those questions, because it did give us a good taste of the book, which
it's a great book.
I've heard from many people that
you've very great book.
Yes. John has asked about the location. Where is this book set? Is it set in the Wimmera region, perhaps?
I have to be a little bit careful about naming the location because it's kind of part of the plot in a way. But I can say it's Australian. It's Australian rural location. It's not the Wimmera. I think if I wrote another book set in the Wimmera, they would lynch me if I went back there. So yeah, no, it's an Australian regional location. You'll discover when you read it.
Right. There's a question from Paul, and I'm not sure if this is going to be, the question itself is not spoilerish yet, but you may be spoilerish if you answer it. I'm going to put it out there anyway, and feel free to pass. The visitor with the deep voice never seems to be resolved. Did I miss something?
Oh, yes, spoilerish. I would say that I'd give this clue. I think it's probably resolved if you kind of reflect deeply on the psychology of the father.
Okay, all right. So cryptic for anyone who has not read it, but hopefully, Paul, you'll get that. Now, Cassie has said, was the perspective always going to be told from this protagonist? And why did you choose that point of view?
Yeah, so it began with that voice of Jacobs, the young boy, and it made sense to me at the time to write from that. I didn't ever think about changing the perspective to the adult perspective. You'll see when if that questioner hasn't read it yet, that it's kind of bookended by a prologue and an epilogue, which is in the adult voice. But certainly it made the most sense to me to write from Jacob's perspective, from that young boy's viewpoint.
And Sarah has asked about your writing routine as well, which you've told us a bit about, but specifically, do you plot?
No, I don't plot. I don't have much of an idea where my books are going. I'd say with Wimmera, because that had more going on structurally and shifts in time and points of view, that when I was at an editing phase, a structural editing phase, I was much more I guess left brain about how I mapped it out. But no, in my drafting phases, it's just lurching from one page to the next and hoping, that it will end up in a form that makes sense. And I feel like part of writing is kidding yourself that you'll get there and that it will work by the end. You're just going, this is good, this is going to be okay, like it's great. And it's partly just convincing yourself of that along the way, because we've all got those bits of self-doubt, just thinking, this isn't working, this is terrible, am I wasting, you can spend 6-12 months longer working on something that is never going to work properly. So I think, you need a bit of that self-delusion happening as well.
Now, Ruben has asked about your interest in unreliable narrators, which has seems to follow you throughout all of your books. Is this something that you're going to continue? Is this your thing, that you're going to write unreliable narrators?
I actually hadn't thought about my books from that point of view. That's an interesting point. I'd say the manuscript I'm working on now, which I'm sort of loath to talk about, it probably does lean into that a little bit as well. So I must like it. I mean, you tend to write the stuff that you like to read, and I quite enjoy the unreliable narrator, but you don't want to be too I guess I'm always careful. Like I don't want to be showing too much of my hand in the work, if you know what I mean. Like as an author, like you want the reader to be in there and for it to be a believable world and the characters to be believable. And the minute that they start to think that the author is pulling some strings and making something happening or omitting information that should otherwise be there, then it kind of spoils it. I sort of think it's like casting a spell in a way when you're writing, and you've got to keep the reader in that spell the whole way. So I'm always conscious of that.
That kind of segues into Cass Moriarty's question here, which is about authors gravitating towards particular themes or the way they explore things. And I suppose that's something you gravitate towards, is that unreliable narrator. But are there other themes that you feel like you have been able to spot in your work that you're constantly searching for?
Yeah, I think that as kind of I mentioned earlier, like the trauma, the impact of trauma, and not only on the individuals but in a generational sense at times as well, is something that seems to crop up in my work. And I think that's partly informed by my professional experience and my background working in the justice system, and seeing kind of the ways that those childhood experiences can impact on people. You know, I think I could spend a lot of time analysing my own work, and I'd be my own worst analyst. I think that others are probably better placed to pick those threads apart. But yeah, I'd say, yeah, those darker elements of humanity keep cropping up, so that's probably where I'll end up going again.
Well, Cass also says that My Absolute Darling, like your books, is a perfect example of a very successful dark writing. Do you think dark novels need, do you think they need a hopeful ending, or the possibility of promise in there, or can it just be relentlessly dark and it will work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I loved My Absolute Darling. I mean, I know a lot of people wouldn't and don't. I think work can be relentlessly, well, I don't say relentlessly dark, but it doesn't have to end on a positive note of, life will get better, or everyone's going to be rescued, or whatever it might be. I think about good examples probably. I know people have read Willie Vlaughton before, and he write, his stories are not particularly happy. Yeah, that's right. I'm dying to read that, but I love Willie Vlaughton, and he writes beautifully of these really flawed characters in dire circumstances, and but there's beauty there. There's light in the way that he writes about these people, despite the fact of these terrible things happening to them. So I think you can have a whole lot of bad shit happening to people. That's fine, but you need to have, I guess, some texture in there, some light and shade. I don't think it can be relentlessly. I'm trying to think of a book that's relentlessly bleak, and I can't.
Cormac McCarthy, perhaps. I don't think there's any comedy in any of his books.
Probably Blood Meridian in particular. Yeah, that's a bit of an assault. I felt like
nightmares for about a week while I was reading Blood Meridian. I would wake up from these dreams of these battles where I was killing people. Anyway.
Oh, yeah, some of those scenes, yeah, of the battles and people getting scalped, and yeah, tough stuff.
Pretty tough. Yes, Cormac McCarthy is possibly relentlessly bleak, but beautiful writing. Beautiful. Exactly. Yeah. So yes. Look, there's a couple of other questions, probably a bit too spoilerish, I would say, to answer. Like, did you ever have another ending to this book? Don't tell us what it is, but was there ever, this is from Cassie, was there ever another ending?
Yes. It was partly through working on the novel with my publisher, Vanessa Radnich at Hachette, that because this book obviously went through, as all books do, a lot of iterations and drafts, and it did have it had a darker ending originally than what it has. So perhaps that is partly an answer to that earlier question. But I think, I'm, in terms of the story I wanted to tell, it's telling the story better now than the way that I had it. So it's a bit of a process with me and my publisher. I think that Vanessa's great at sort of finding those spaces where where light can get into my work. Whereas at first, yeah, they can be a little bit bleak.
Oh, nothing wrong with bleak, I reckon. You did mention that you were working on something else, and somebody is asking about that. Are you deep in the middle? Do you start working on something as you're still promoting the book before? Does that happen for you?
Yeah, ordinarily I would, like I had a draft sort of just before the others came out, so I had a complete draft. Ordinarily I would have just focused on the publicity stuff and then gone back to that afterwards, but given lockdown and all that happening, I had a bit more spare time on my hands being at home. So I've gone back into to that draft, which is good. Like it's good to have some focus, you know, through all of this. And writing is, as you know, like it's great, but some days it's terrible and it can be really hard. But that process is really what sustains me. Having a book out in the world is wonderful, and having people read it is great, but the actual process of working on something, being in my room focused on that document, trying to make that world real is what I love.
Fantastic. Look, it has been my absolute pleasure to host this event tonight. As Brandi tells me, this is a fantastic book and I am looking forward to reading it.
Such a great book.
Yeah, so if you didn't get that link before, I'll put that link again to the book, which you can go and purchase that at Avid Reader. But also, if you are in Melbourne, or particularly if you're in Sydney, I think at the moment, maybe think about supporting your local independent bookseller instead, because I know they do it tough during lockdowns. So thank you, guys, and thank you, Brandi. That was a fantastic conversation.
Thank you.
Really hope we can.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for having us, Avid.
Thanks, Brandi, and yeah, thanks, Chrissy and Avid. It was great.
Well, I really hope we can get to do this actually in person one day. So cross fingers that there will be a time where we catch up again. So hopefully we'll see you very soon. See you later, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.